Hey there, TouchDesigner developers. Jack DiLaura here with the Interactive and Immersive HQ. In this video, we are going to dive back into particlesGPU, which, if you are not familiar with it already, is a fantastic tool built into TouchDesigner that allows you to, as the name might suggest, create a particle system using the GPU. That has a number of advantages over the typical SOP-based technique, the most notable of which is that we can generate many more particles, a more complex system, because it is running all on the GPU. That said, this is going to be a very beginner-friendly effect today. We're going to walk through how you can start to use the different functions of the tool, as well as some more advanced functionality like using a 2D texture array to apply different textures to the particles. So with that said, stick around. We are going to jump right into building this. So as usual, we're going to start with a blank network, and we're actually going to open up the palette for once instead of closing it. So if you have closed it already, go ahead and hit Control B on the keyboard or Command B if you're on the Mac. Head to the Tools folder and then grab the particlesGPU effect. Drag that into your network, and then we'll take a brief look at it, and you can go ahead and close the palette as well. So we have a sort of demonstration set up right now where we're generating leaves that are actually being generated via a grid, which we can't see, but is located at the top of this bounding box. And then we have some gravity basically being applied to the leaves, which then is pulling them towards the bottom of this box. If you haven't worked with particlesGPU before, we have a number of pages available to us of parameters. We're not going to do a super deep dive into the nuts and bolts of every single one of them, but we are going to use at least some of them in this example, and they're well worth kind of exploring on your own as well. The first page is basically general settings, including things like the way that the particles are created. We've got a couple of options there, how many are born per frame, how long their life expectancy is, things like that. We control the size here. We control the scale of this bounding box, and then some other sort of settings like parameters. Then the next page is forces, where we apply a variety of different forces, including wind and turbulence, which are fun and interesting. The rendering page is where everything rendering is located, as you might expect, including the very handy fade in and fade out settings. So that is something that comes with this by default that you do not get when you are using the typical SOP-based particle system. It has this very nice smooth fade in and fade out of the particles when they are created or die. Then we've got the material page, which you can choose things like your typical shader or rather material options for the shading of those particles, as well as whatever texture you'd like to apply to them. So right now we have it set to leaf, and that's why we're seeing leaves on the screen. But for both of these, we can also choose to specify our own material and our own texture as well. Then we've got a particle source page, which if we are not sending in a particle source, which is the geometry that the particles will be generated from, it will basically gives us a sort of built-in functionality to have accessible some of the common shapes and pieces of geometry that you might use in this kind of situation. So in our example, we are not going to be using this page. In fact, as soon as we plug something in to our first input, it will no longer be accessible anyway. Then you've got the about page, and everything else is a standard sort of container setup. So we have a number of things to get started working on. And as you can see here on the left side of the operator, we've got a number of different inputs. If you ever worked with an older version of particlesGPU, this has been updated maybe a little bit over a year ago at this point or more, and now has a bunch of top texture inputs instead of what used to be, I believe, maybe some SOP and CHOP inputs for the old version. So we're going to be working with textures, and we're going to be providing textures for the particle source, which, as I said, is the geometry that is generating our particle system, as well as a couple of other things like the particle initial velocity and the color that we're applying to it. So without further ado, that is going to be the furthest we're going to get into explanation zone. Let's start building this network. So we need some geometry for our particle source, and we're going to head over to the SOP page in order to do that. So I'm going to grab a circle SOP. This initial set of SOP geometry is all based on the circle SOP. We're going to set the orientation to ZX so that it is sort of flat along the ground plane, so to speak. Then we're going to modify the radius and set this to a value of 5 by 5. And then we're also going to shift the center. We want to shift this below the X and the Z axis slightly. So I'm going to set this to -3 in the center Y position value there, which again has shifted it below those axes. And then we're going to bump up our number of divisions, which is going to increase the total number of points in this circle to 44. And then finally, we're going to set the arc type here to open arc so that we basically have a wireframe. Now that doesn't really matter for generating particles, but it helps us kind of visualize what is happening with our effect. From there, we're going to add a copy SOP, make a couple of duplicates of this circle, which are going to be stacked together in a cylindrical fashion. So I'm going to set my number of copies here to a value of not 54, but 5. And those are currently all stacked on top of each other. So I'm going to head down to the translate parameter and set that to a value of 1.5, which will then cumulatively translate them upwards. And we now have our cylindrical stack of circles. That's the geometry that we're going to start with for this effect. So to, again, bring it over into particlesGPU land, we need to have a top texture. So we're going to have to do the typical SOP to CHOP, and then take that CHOP and convert it into a top texture. So let's go ahead and add a null after this copy SOP for good measure. Move that to the left, and then I'll right click on the output of the null SOP, head to the CHOP page, grab a SOP to CHOP, add that to the network, and then I will add a null after that, and then we're going to right click on the output of that null, head to the top page, grab a CHOP to top. So again, all that we're trying to do here basically is to take this data, all of these points essentially that make up these circles, and translate that into a top texture, which is going to tell our particlesGPU system where to actually spawn the particles from. And this is just kind of the method that we have to use because of the way TouchDesigner functions. So we have some stuff we actually have to do in this CHOP to top before we can move on. So first of all, you'll notice we have 3 channels of information because of course we're working in 3D and we have X, Y, and Z positions for our point values. Now, right now, we are basically only grabbing the TX channel, and thus we need to set our data format to grab all 3 of these channels. So we'll set this to RGB instead. You'll have noticed that we now have a color output instead. The other thing that I'm going to do for kind of sake of ease of use with some of the other textures we're going to be working with is to set this image layout to fit to square, which will turn this into a square texture instead of a single sort of row of pixels. Finally, I'm going to head to the common page where I'm going to set the viewer smoothness parameter to nearest pixel to get rid of that interpolation because we don't really need it for this example. From there, I can actually go ahead and plug this chop2 directly into that first input, which remember is the particle source. And that immediately should have changed what you see in the particles GPU operator. We're no longer generating the particles or spawning them from that grid at the top of our bounding box. We're now, actually, we are using that stack of circles to generate them, but we've got some other settings applied which make it a little bit hard to see what the initial geometry actually looks like. So now is a good moment to make a couple of settings changes so that this can start looking a little bit more like what our initial kind of example was at the beginning of the video. So we kind of went over the pages already, and the place that I'm going to start for this actually is to get rid of these leaf textures, first of all, because that, kind of is a little distracting and makes us think we're going to be generating a leaf pile instead of a bunch of floating numbers. So to do that, I'm going to head to the material page. We're going to be using in a moment a custom material. So I'm just going to go ahead and preemptively set our material here to custom. You'll notice that that has left us with leaves, and that's okay. We're going to add that material right now, and then those will disappear. So we're going to use a constant material for this. And again, we're going to be working with this a little bit more in a moment. So I'm just going to kind of put it below this operator, and then I want to drag that into our custom material parameter there. And you'll see what has happened now is we have a bunch of squares flat squares that are falling instead of the leaves. So that's great. That is setting us up for success in a moment and kind of taking things out of leaf world. Another thing that is happening, which you may have noticed, is that we have basically a gravitational pull towards the bottom of this box, which is not something that was in the initial effect. So that is being added on the forces page, and we're going to set this external force to a value of 0 in the y direction, and that will immediately remove that pull downwards on our particles. Another thing that is different from the effect that we're going for is that all of the particles are actually rotating continuously over time instead of just sort of being applied or a random rotation value applied to them and then staying in that position throughout the simulation. That is happening via this rotation section at the bottom. You'll notice we have rotation speed settings for X, Y, and Z. And when we're in this continuous mode, it's going to use those to continuously rotate each particle. So what I can do then is to set all of those values to 0. And then what'll happen is every time that a new particle is spawned, it will have a randomized initial rotation, but it will not continue to rotate after that that initial state. So we're good on this page for now. Let's head to the particles GPU page and make a couple of tweaks here as well. So I mentioned we have some settings around the birth and the life expectancy of these particles. The ones that the settings that I had set up for the initial version had the particles last for a shorter amount of time on screen so that they don't sort of accumulate like we're seeing right now. So I'm going to set the life parameter here, first of all, to a value of 4. And then another handy tool in your toolbox here is this reset switch at the bottom, which you can click at any point to start the simulation over again. And that can be useful when you change certain settings. It'll, again, regenerate everything so that you can rest assured that your new settings are applied across all particles. So from there, we're going to increase the positive limit plane and the negative limit plane, which basically will increase the size of this bounding box just ever so slightly. I'm going to bump those up to the positive limit plane to a value of 5 for each one of the parameters there. And then the negative one, I'm going to set that to -5 so that we have a slightly larger bounding box. Now, we've made some of the core changes in terms of the positioning and the life expectancy of our particles. And you might be wondering, why does this look a little bit different than what we had at the beginning? We're getting a sort of donut shape. Obviously, we don't have any force pulling these things towards the center, but our particles are kind of spawning in this loose ring formation instead of following the exact points that we've generated back here with our circles. This is a good learning moment for everyone and a teachable moment because it's not exactly obvious maybe at first. So if we go, we look at our operator here, this is the texture that is providing the point positions, and we turned it to nearest pixel so that, we don't have any interpolation. We've got nice sharp edges and nothing is being interpolated. However, if we go inside of our particlesGPU operator and we find that texture, which is right here, particle source. I'll just change this back to color. You can see, oh, what's this? It has added interpolation back into the mix. And there actually is a setting somewhere for this, right here. So in the remap operator after this particle source, which is being used to randomly kind of shift the position around for the spawning of the particles, as you can see by this note here, that actually has the ability to adjust the input smoothness. So basically can allow us to compensate for the fact that this texture is being interpolated once again and giving us these kind of smoothed out boundaries between the pixels. So that interpolation is actually what is causing us to have this kind of, not super true to our input geometry sort of shape that we have, this sort of loose donut stack, or I guess it even looks a little bit like a spring. What I found is, for some reason, even though this switch here actually affects the interpolation that is either being added or not being added to the input, it is grayed out when we have connected a particle source. However, if we then disconnect that particle source from the first input and flip this interpolate source point position off, which again, I forgot to mention, this is on the particle source page, and then we reconnect the chop to that first input, oh, look at this. We have very nicely aligned particles to our geometry that we are sending in. So that is a lesson to show you how interpolation can impact things in unexpected ways, even though, it's the same data that we're working with. It's just a slight filtering. So the more you know. Again, we've got some more things to continue on with, and I think we will continue here by working with color, and then we'll move on into the world of texture as well. So for the color, what we're going to do is add a ramp top. So we're going to head back to the texture page to add some color. We're going to add the ramp top to the network. And this is going to be set up pretty much as it is, except that I'm going to set the type here to vertical. Then I'm going to connect this to a noise. So we've got a noise that we've added to the network and didn't intend to auto connect to that output. So I'm going to disconnect that. I'm going to take this ramp and connect it to the second input of the noise coordinate map, which is going to give us a very different noise texture, which in a minute we're going to use to recolor our particle system. So within the noise, we do have some changes to make. Not too many though. First of all, I want to set the monochrome switch to off because we want to apply color to this and not grayscale. And then I'm going to set my period value to 10 so that we have a smoother sort of gradient shift along our noise coordinate map. And then I'm going to go ahead and just grab any random seed value that looks good. This looks like a pretty nice set of colors, so I'm just going to go with that. Go ahead and pick whatever seed value you want, and then I'm going to use a remap to use this data to basically map these colors in the correct positions to each one of these circles. So let's just do this without adding a limit top, first of all, so that you can understand why we need the limit top. So we're going to use a remap in order to map this color across the data of this texture. This is what is called our UV texture in this second input, the UV image. And then this is the thing that we want to remap. So we're going to plug that into our first source image input. Now you'll notice that we've done the remapping, but we really don't see the color hardly at all. And that's because our point position values are actually, they are not in the typical UV range of 0 to 1. They are point positions with values in the, I guess, something like -5 to +5 range, as we can see from our graph here. And so it basically is far beyond the range of a UV texture that the remap is expecting. So what we can do is to insert a limit right before we connect that to the remap. And then within the limit, we can go to this normalize function and turn that on. And that will have changed that range, basically used some math to bring that into the 0 to 1 range. And you'll then notice that we have some nice color being output by this operator here. So we have a couple of additional things that I want to accomplish before we move on to connecting this. First of all, I want the resolution source to actually come from the UV image itself, although that makes things look a little bit strange. The reason that we're doing that is because we want to basically have this match the number of pixels that we are being provided and that are generating our particle systems. So we've done that. And then the other thing that I'm going to do is to set the extend mode here to hold, which instead of zeroing it out as we had before, has now given us some nice clean bands of color. And then I'm just gonna, for the heck of it, change the viewer and input smoothness to nearest pixel. Then I can go ahead and connect that straight to the second input, and we can see here as our particles start to regenerate, we now have different colors applied to each one of these circles, and that was all accomplished via this remap. So the remap basically is looking at the data coming in from this input. It allows you to pick a color channel for the horizontal and vertical source, allowing you to map those colors across this 3D information in the way that you want. So very cool, very useful operator to have access to. Now, our particles, they are looking pretty good. We've got the circles, we've got the colors. How about that sort of movement that we saw at the beginning? So the way that that was accomplished, we're going to head back to the forces page. We have this initial velocity section. What this can allow us to do is if we provide an input for our particle velocity input, which is the third one here, it will use whatever values are being sent into this input to give these particles an initial velocity. And what we can do actually is to use the texture that is giving the positions for that initial velocity as well. So I've just gone ahead and connected the chop straight to that third input. And what we'll notice is nothing has happened. That's okay. That's because of the kind of default settings that we have available, or that have come with the operator by default, that is. So this initial velocity section basically allows us to choose the amount and the directions that we are applying whatever is coming in this input to. So it's not to say that we're, going to be applying a force upwards for all the particles. It is, again, allowing us to basically like attenuate and choose how this texture is being applied to the particles themselves. So what I'm going to do here is we want these to move towards the center, which means we want force, or velocity rather, in the X direction, and we want it in the Z direction, but not the Y direction. And that will give us horizontal movement in along those axes and not up and down movement. Now, what we'll notice is that is causing our particles to move outwards from their initial point instead of inwards. And so we can use this magnitude parameter, set that to a value of -3, to instead generate those particles and send them inward. And actually what I meant here was not -3, but -0.3 to give us a much slower generation. And there we go. That's looking pretty interesting. We've got some more settings to tweak, but that is getting us closer. We're at least moving things towards the center of our screen. So from there, one other component that we are going to need to modify within the particles GPU operator itself is, if we come back to the particles GPU page, we have this size parameter, which we haven't yet done anything with. So the size type is set to random. So every time a new particle is generated, it has a random size applied to it. We want to instead use the age of that particle to control the size of the particle. Now, this has created a very interesting kind of output with some very large particles being generated, which is not exactly what we want. However, we have this ability here to provide a chop to control this. So what I'm going to do is add an S-curve chop, which is a very useful chop. Gives us a nice curve, which we can control all sorts of different aspects of. I'm going to then drag this into the size lookup parameter for the size section of particles GPU. And then we'll notice that we have some movement and stuff going on screen, but everything is really, really small. So the way that we can modify this sort of range of size for our particles is to use this toRange parameter. So what I'm going to do here is set the initial value to a value of 2. That means at this end of the graph here, we have a value of 2. And what this means in the context of this size lookup parameter is when a particle is first born, it's going to have a size of 2. And then when it is kind of gone through its life cycle and gets close to dying, it is going to fall in size to a value of 1. If we then say bump that end size up to a value of 5, what'll happen is as the particle continues on in its lifespan, it actually will increase in size rather than decrease. So that, again, that's a way for you to very explicitly control the behavior of the size. And there's actually a number of places where you can apply different lookup chops in that way. So we have some other things to take care of. Let's set this drag setting to 0 as well, which you may have noticed now allows those particles to move towards the center and not sort of end in that ring shape. That's, again, gotten us one step closer to the result from the beginning. And I think what we have left to do now, our final kind of step, is to add some texture to these particles. So we're not just dealing with colorful squares, we've actually got some text applied to them. So what I'm going to do for that is to add a text top to the network. And oops, I didn't mean to grab those together. I just want to move the text top down and to the left. And here I'm going to basically output the current frame that is being played back in our timeline at the bottom. To do that in the text parameter, I'm going to type in me.time.frame. And then we'll set the text here parameter from the constant to the expression mode. We'll see then that we have a nice float value that increases and of course is synced up with the timeline. I'm going to convert this to an integer by typing in int and then open parenthesis and then add a close parenthesis to the end. And then I'm also going to subtract 1 from that value because I want the initial value, which is actually frame 1 way over here at the left of the timeline. I want that to be a value of 0 for the specific setup that we're going to be creating. The next part is going to involve choosing a font. So this is going to completely depend on what you have installed on your machine. I'm just going to choose, I just chose this font at random. I had this one called Bondschrift, and so I've gone ahead and chose that. Then you may have noticed that the font size is pretty small. If we think about it, this is the square of each particle, and we're really only using a tiny amount of that texture up, and so we're sort of wasting the texture a little bit, which is fine if that's the look that you want. But I'm going to utilize that space a little bit better by changing the font size that we have available. So I'm going to set this to the fraction mode, and then I'm going to set my font size X to 0.75. Now, you'll notice that that is cutting off the edges of the text. We're actually only going to be grabbing the first 100 numbers from this and storing them as frames, and thus we don't really need to worry about any situation where we have 3 digits appearing. So what we can do here is to pause this momentarily and move backwards in the timeline. Basically, what we want to take into consideration is when we have 2 numbers for our current frame number, how are those sort of appearing in this text, and do we have a nice amount of border space around them? So this is, again, highly dependent on the typeface that you choose, so adjust your font size accordingly. I will unpause the timeline there, and then the other thing that I've done is I just used the vertical align mode of use text bounding box because I found that centered it in the vertical direction a little bit better. And then I changed the resolution on the output page to 512 by 512. So that is all set. The next thing is to add a rectangle. I just used the rectangle top to add a little border for a little bit of stylistic flair on this particular texture. So I'm going to set the size parameter here to 0.9. And then I'm going to, first of all, remove the fill alpha. So set that to 0. Then I'm going to set this border width to 0.05, which has given us a nice square around the edge of that texture. And then I'm going to set the border color here to a light gray color. And I did this in order to have that is to say, my original version of this had a border color of 0.6 for all of the RGB values there. That is it for that particular operator. Next, we're going to plug this into a texture 3D top. If you haven't used this before, it basically allows you to store a number of frames into memory, and then you can recall these and use them in a number of ways, including, in this case, to be applied to the different particles in our system. So we're going to do a couple of things. First of all, we're going to turn this pre-fill switch to on. And you'll notice that because we've synced this number up with the timeline, it uses the timeline for this pre-fill setting. And thus we have a nice sequential ordering of these frames from the initial frame, which we've made 0 up to the maximum, which is based on the cache size. So if I set that cache size to 100 and then pulse the prefill, again, we'll have 99 frames, well, actually 100 frames, with the first one being 0. One final thing to do with this texture 3D, which is actually extremely important, so make sure that you have this setting set the right way, otherwise it will not function correctly, is to set this from a 3D texture to a 2D texture array. Then we're going to go ahead and pulse the prefill button there again. It's not going to look any different, but it is important for applying it to our network. And then I'm going to add a null after that, and we can supply it as the color map for this constant operator. So I'm going to drag that into the color map parameter. Within the constant operator, go ahead and also make sure that you've turned on blending transparency and the discard pixels based on alpha switch as well. Once you've done that, we should be able to take a look in the viewer here and see something that looks almost correct. Now, the animation looks great. We have the sort of shape and color distribution and textures being applied. But you probably have noticed that the numbers that we're generating here are only ever sort of falling between, it looks like 0 and 4. And that has to do with one additional setting that we need to modify before this is complete. So let's head back to the network and take a look at the material page of particlesGPU. Now, this is another kind of situation where if you do things out of order, it might be confusing because you lose access to certain settings. So because we set our material here to custom before we modified this texture parameter, we don't then have access to the particle texture map parameter, which is what we need in order to make those number textures appear and function correctly as they did at the beginning. So what we actually have to do then is to change back to a different mode of the material first. So I'm going to set this to constant, and then I want to swap from leaf to custom as well. And then we can actually go back from the material here from the constant to custom. And you'll notice now we have the particle texture map, even though we no longer have access to the texture setting itself. And now that we have that parameter available to us, we can say drag this null3 operator into the particle texture map parameter. And what that should have accomplished, if we take a look at the viewer, is that we are now getting the full range of numbers, or of all of those textures that we have stored within that operator, appearing in our little particle system that we've created. So that is actually it for this video. Of course, there are pretty much limitless ways to continue exploring with this one. Highly recommend doing things like coming back to the very beginning of the network here and trying all sorts of different SOPs. The way we've set it up, you can simply just plug in, anything that you can come up with basically, and have it start spawning on screen. You can also, of course, approach the color application differently as well. It doesn't have to be a noise that we plug into the remap here. It can be, anything that you like. And the same goes for this texture 3D operator. We don't have to have this simple text with a border plugged into it. It can be, again, anything that you can dream up in TouchDesigner. It can be a movie file, frames, pretty much, the sky's the limit there. So I hope that has given you a good sort of base level introduction to a lot of the common parameters that you'll use when you work with this operator, and some of the creative possibilities and potential for utilizing some of those tools to make interesting effects. With that, we're going to close out the video. As always, thank you so much for watching. Looking forward to seeing you in the next video here on the Interactive and Immersive HQ.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you're serious about taking your TouchDesigner and interactive skills to the next level, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. It's the only educational resource and community of its kind for TouchDesigner and interactive professionals. You can learn more by checking out the link in the description. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe and the little bell icon for more awesome free content.